Blind Nil Audio.
Greetings, this is 50 Fires, and I'm Carl Richards. And on today's show, I have Gatti Tassin, and I'm so excited about it because this conversation is exactly why I started 50 Fires. We're not here to talk about budgeting apps or life insurance. We're here to talk about money and meaning, the stories we tell ourselves about our relationship with money, the contradictions we have to live with, and of course, the changes that we all make along the way. And I can think of nobody better to have this conversation with than Katie. Katie is one of the most thoughtful voices in personal finance, and we got to explore it all today. We talked about why spending money sometimes feels wrong, why capitalism has many of us feeling just at least a little bit conflicted, and why abundance is not just a number in a bank account. If you've ever struggled with your relationship with money, how to feel about it, and money and meaning, this conversation is for you. Katie started Money with Katie in 2020, and she quickly became one of the most engaging and widely followed voices in personal finance, really helping an entire generation rethink the way they approach money. She also hosts the Money with Katie show, an incredible podcast where she dives deep into the intersection of finance, psychology, and big picture economic ideas. And she's got a new book. Excited to tell you that she's got a new book coming out this summer called Rich Girl Nation, which you can pre-order now anywhere where you buy books. And before we dive in, I just want to mention one thing. Katie's incredibly thoughtful. And she's also not afraid to have an opinion about something she cares deeply about. One of the things I hoped to accomplish with 50 Fires is to create the kind of space where we could wrestle with the ideas that surround money, where we could have conversations that might challenge us, might knock us a little off center, might force us to rethink something that we've always assumed to be true. So maybe as you listen to this conversation, try something. Instead of listening to decide whether you agree or disagree with any given moment, just listen to understand. Because that's what I'm after. Not agreement, but understanding. And we don't have to agree with one another to understand one another. Conversations about money, whether it's with your neighbor, a spouse, a coworker, or the person sitting next to you on the plane, will almost always involve things we see differently. But if we can't listen or create space for those types of conversations, how will we ever solve the big problems that we face? And guess what? Almost all of the big problems we face involve money. So with that, I'm so excited to bring you this conversation with Gatti Tassin. Money with Katie, Rich Girl Nation, all of that stuff is now part of...
So Money with Katie is something that I started in 2020 on my own, and then it was acquired by Morning Brew, which is a Business Insider subsidiary, in early 2022.
So good. Well, here's the challenge for today. We've had a lot of people on this show that have deep expertise, and my goal is to get you out of that expertise a little bit. So I might have to keep reminding you. Like, I actually want to hear, and from reviewing all your stuff and all the research we did, which I have like 18 pages of notes, which we obviously won't need, but it was really, really fun. I don't think it's going to be a problem having a conversation, like a real, you're very, very good at having real conversations. It seems to be one of the things you kind of hang your hat on, this idea of transparency and dare I say, like vulnerability and like all the words.
Okay.
But I may remind you a time or two, like, hey, let's get out of like, I'm personal finance expert and back to I'm Katie. So we'll see. Cause I want to vacillate between the two. So let's let's do this because I'm hoping that this will be one of those conversations that you do have interest in, right?
Okay.
Um, because I'm like you, like if one more person asked me about asset allocation or budgeting apps, like 7 years ago, I was done. So let's start here. I'm actually really curious, Katie. What's your earliest memory of money?
Two things are coming to mind. I don't actually know which one would have happened first, but there are two things that I have a strong memory of as a kid. The first was being at the grocery store
Mm,
and watching my mom pay with a credit card. It may have been a debit card. I don't know. She paid with a card. And I remember being like, "Oh, well, if you're just paying with the like if you're paying with a piece of plastic, then why can't I go get the toy?" Like it kind of didn't connect, which is no, it's still our money, but like
right.
it was like this other thing that I couldn't wrap my head around as a kid. So I
Yeah.
guess the first memory I have of money is probably related to being like, "Oh, we have a magic card that can buy us
Right.
things?
Right.
Sweet."
Right.
Um, but that's probably it's kinda connected though to the fact that something that I observed her doing from, like, a very young age, and like I said, I think that this is, like, one of my first kind of formative memories of how money worked, was she kept all of the receipts that we would accumulate, like, on a stack on her desk, and every time we would come home from doing anything, she would sit down with her spreadsheet and, like, enter in the numbers, and so I have so many
Wow.
of getting home from, like, the grocery store, dinner, church, like, anywhere we went where money was exchanged, the first thing that would happen when we got home was she would walk into the
Wow.
computer room, sit down with us and, like, put the numbers in, and she'd be doing something on the screen. So from a very early age, it was kind of like that to me felt like an extension of a transaction. It was like, "Okay, you buy the thing and then you put the number in the computer."
Wow, that's what do you make of that now? Like, what was
Oh,
your mom
man.
doing? What was going on there?
Obviously, the surface level answer is, well, she was budgeting.
Right,
Like,
right,
that
right.
was what
That's
she was doing.
exactly.
But I think what that did was establish this idea of the like, money is something to be controlled.
Mm,
Like, it's something that you should try
mm,
to
mm,
exert control over.
mm,
Um, and that was how she did it. It was something to be carefully tracked and monitored and controlled,
mm,
and if you didn't watch it closely, something
mm,
bad might happen. I think that
mm,
was kind of the
mm.
message that I internalized from that. If I'm
Yeah,
psychoanalyzing myself now in retrospect.
yeah. That's so interesting. The idea of like control and watch and
Mhm.
track. Um, and we'll get to this later, but I've been really curious about your views on mindset and particularly around like abundance and scarcity, which we'll get to in a minute. But I'm curious, was there any conversation in your home growing up about what was going on? Like, what was money like? Did you talk about money? Did your parents talk about money?
Oh,
Did
yeah, all the time.
really?
Yeah.
What?
Mhm.
Because that now you know that's unusual. I know you pointed that out in your work. Like talking about money is unusual.
Mhm. They
What?
did.
Tell me
All
about it.
sorts of things. Well, one thing that I came to realize later as an adult that was strange is that I knew how much money my parents made.
Stop it!
Like,
Really?
I would ask them, "Yeah, how much money do you make? Like, what do we have?" Because
Huh?
it was always kind of a constant presence in our home that if I asked for something, like if I wanted something, I was like, "That's too expensive. You need that, like,
Hmm.
ask for it for your birthday, maybe for Christmas." Like, that would kind of be the response. Um, my mom, I remember I'd go grocery shopping with her every week, and she was I remember she'd, like, she still does this, by the way. This isn't like a like something she moved past. Like, they're retired now, she still does this. I go to the grocery store with her, she talks to herself under her breath, and she's, "Okay, so it's 5 for a dollar 10 or 6 for 1.15. Okay, so the unit price is this." And she's, like, doing this every single thing that she's buying, she's sitting there and analyzing. closely what is the best. I don't like, that's not me. I go to
Right.
Whole Foods. I don't even look at the price. Like, that's the point where I'm like, that's luxury to me. That's being
Right.
wealthy. As you go to the good grocery store, you don't even look at how much the thing costs. And that is like the pinnacle of privilege to me, is
Right.
that. And so
Right.
once I got to the point that I could do that, I was like, I'm not sitting there like,
Right.
no. But that was how money kind of was talked about. So I think I was aware of the fact that, like, okay, they're like carefully managing this resource. I will hear words like afford or like too
Mm.
expensive.
Mm.
Um or my mom had this phrase, waste not, want not. Um so like, she's reusing the paper plates, like that type of thing. And so, yeah, I remember asking them, like, well, how much money do you make? Well, why did mom quit her job? Things like that. And they were like
Wow.
relatively forthcoming with me in answering those questions. But um, there was always an emphasis on saving, on living beneath your means, on not
Wow.
wasting things. So, yeah, it was kind of like an undercurrent of conversation in my house
Wow.
growing
Are
up.
are you how do you feel about that? Are you grateful for that education? Are you unwinding some of it? Like what how do
Mm,
you feel about that? Cuz that sounds really healthy is not the word I want to use. It just sounds really open and interesting. Like
mhm.
most people's experience about money is not that open,
Yeah.
right? It's nice that that was at least talked about out in the open.
Yeah. I am grateful for it. To the extent that I'm unwinding any of it, I think I'm unwinding the idea still that spending money is wrong,
Hmm.
morally wrong. Like,
Mhm.
that there is something, I guess, in tandem with all of that. It's also worth knowing that I was like in Catholic school my whole life. So Catholic guilt is like
Right.
my second language.
Right. Right.
But there is a very kind of close tie there of like,
Yeah.
I think the kind of the solid Catholic conservative values are like, you're not showy. You don't spend more than you need to. Like, if
Right.
you can get the cheap, and that was just never me. Like, as a
Yeah.
kid, even I
Yeah.
think they were frankly kind of scared when I was
Yeah.
little, because I would get money for my birthday. It would be gone the next day. And it wasn't just like gone on, candy at the grocery store. It was like I wanted to go to the mall and get like the flashiest coat that I could find. So I was like very much a showboat of a child, and like
Yeah.
loved makeup, loved clothes, loved fashion, spent money as quickly as it came into my possession. And so I think they were like, "Oh my god, she's going to have serious issues as an adult if she does not kind of like get
Right.
this in line."
Right.
But I think that sort of thing sometimes, like, sometimes I will overspend on something, where like I bought a very nice car. I bought a Porsche, and that felt really like as
Yeah.
much as it was like you run the numbers and it's like, no, this is fine. Like, this is actually totally
Right.
fine. I can afford this and we're good. And I really want it. And I thought about it for a long time. Like, it wasn't an impulse buy at all. I like planned it for years. But still, there's something about it that it's like, this just feels kind of wrong. Like, it just kind of
Yeah.
feels showy and wasteful. And so I think that there's some of that I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about it. Like, well, on
Yeah.
some level, it is kind of showy and wasteful. And is that okay? Like, maybe it can be showy and wasteful and you can still be comfortable with it. Or maybe it's not showy and wasteful and you've like really internalized this idea that having nice things is bad. Like, I think I'm actually not sure even today where I come down on that, because
Mm.
I
Mm.
still don't know. Like, there's a part of me that's like, well, maybe both things are true. Like,
Right.
maybe it is showy and wasteful, and maybe it's also okay to buy yourself a nice car. Like,
Yeah.
where do we land?
What tell me about the feeling, like, when you say, like, it feels like spending money feels wrong, or I'm still not sure how I feel about like, when you
Mhm.
go let's just go to the car. You go
Mhm.
do the car thing,
Yeah.
you drive home, you put it in the garage, you go inside, and you have the what, like, many people would call normal buyer's remorse, where you're wondering, but you add on this layer of let's just call it, like, puritanical or Catholic guilt.
Mhm.
What does that feel like?
I'm trying to put myself back in that headspace of like what it feels like to waste. Um,
And let me clarify. Does that mean what it feels like to feel like you're being wasteful?
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
What does it feel like to feel like how does waste feel physically?
Yeah.
Um, I think it's less of like a physical sense in the body as much as it is maybe like a self-consciousness. Like I
Huh.
think I hear my
Yeah.
parents'
Right.
voices in
Right.
my
Right.
head a lot. Like what would
Mm-hmm.
they say about this? Um
Mm.
Fortunately my dad really likes cars. And you may have noticed from all the examples that I just gave you that it's pretty much just my mom that I'm talking about. These are all
Yeah.
mom related examples.
Yeah.
He was much more like kid didn't grow up with like his family didn't have any money. He went to college, got a good job, and was very much like champagne taste on a beer budget growing up. So
Right.
he's much more like, oh, it's nice cars are great. Like, yeah, let's figure out what color interior you should get. So
Right.
even
Right.
they are not
Fashion. Yeah.
quite on the same. She was more the frugal one that I think I inherited those ideas about wastefulness
Yeah.
from, and I think that like it was more so coming from her rather than him. But I still
Yeah.
think that like yeah, I think about what they would say a lot about that kind
So
of
fast.
stuff.
What have you done? Because it's clear you're so thoughtful in the work that you do, and even as you mentioned here, like you're not sure and you're working on what has been helpful for you
Hmm.
in dealing with that? Like, is there a book? Is there something somebody said? Is there a story? Do you have a mantra? What's helpful for you? Because you are obviously not alone in this experience.
I think the thing that's been most helpful in getting over some of that, honestly, has been learning how to be more generous alongside it. So, like, I think part of where the feeling of wastefulness comes from is the idea that it's selfishness. Like, I'm taking too much for myself and this is going to hurt somebody else, or that because I'm overindulging someone else is going to have less. So I think that trying to learn and almost systematize generosity and putting my sort of like redistributive politics into action personally um has helped. It's really relieved that feeling I think of like, well, why should I? You know what it is? It's like, why should I get to shop at Whole Foods? Why should I get to have this nice car? You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm,
I think as
mhm.
I became aware, as I kind of like broke through that veil of ignorance of like growing up, being like, yeah, if you work hard and do all the right things and make the good choices, like you're gonna have a great life, and that's how it works for everybody, and everyone's on, this very like meritocratic idea, and then you kind of like learn about the world and meet other people and get out of your bubble, and it's like, oh, that's not how it works at all. And so I think there was like some level of guilt of like, oh, I'm so fortunate, and like I have been had such a leg up and was given so much, and it's not that I don't want to be like, I think that there is like a part of me that felt bad for then enjoying that good fortune. But so I
Sure.
think it was less about like affirmations or reframing and more about actually just kind of acting on that feeling of like I have more
Hmm,
than I need.
hmm.
It's like, okay, well then give some of it away. Like then give it to somebody else. Um and that's kind of how I've been trying to live my life since kind of coming into more financial success.
I just the last person I interviewed was Peter Singer. Are you familiar with Peter's work?
Mm-mm.
He's probably I think, arguably the most influential moral philosopher alive. And people say he's done more for the extreme poor than anybody. So he was
Really?
basically the father of the idea of effective altruism. Um,
Oh, no way.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And it was wild talking about it was wild talking about like, why would anybody need a car?
Mm.
And so I was trying to get to the same thing with him, like, well, how do you deal with it? And I was trying to find sort of it feels like if you take those feelings to the illogical conclusion, you end up with what some of the philosophers call the repugnant conclusion, meaning like, uh, and where Peter draws the line is you should never give so much that you put yourself in the same situation as the person you're trying to help. He's like, that seems like a clear line, because then you're no longer helpful. In fact, he talks about it as alleviating suffering. So if you put yourself in that spot, you're actually increasing suffering in the world. So
interesting.
It's such a hard thing because I deal with the same thing. Like I'm not sure that we know the other grocery store in town, right? Like there's a Whole Foods, and then we're not sure what else there is. And right across, so but I deal with the same thing. So talk to me about, before we move on, I have one more question about the car.
Okay.
Because there are people who are car people and people who are not, it seems like.
Yeah.
Do you still love it?
I do. I still feel, but I do. However, I think that it was symbolic to me of something.
Right. Sure.
Right? Like, to me, the car was a symbol of I will have made it when. It was like a car that I had been obsessed with since before I started working, and where like the car cost more than my entire salary. And I was like, I could never get a car like that. And so I think I had really exalted it in my mind as a symbol of that's when I'll know that I have made it. And so I think it felt really vindicating to finally be able to buy it. But I think that it's something that I do. It's just so cliche, because I feel like this is like the common experience is like you do buy something that you've maybe held up in your head as like this very special thing or this special memento of success. Or I spent like some of my book advance on it. That was how I ended up buying it. And it feels really good for a couple weeks, and then it just kind of becomes your life as it's just my car now. But it does still feel special to me. I don't want to play it off as though like, oh yeah, it's just the same, whatever. I don't feel blasé about it. Still, every time I drive it, I'm like, I can't believe this is my car. So it still feels very cool. But at the end of the day, I think I think it did kind of serve as a lesson of like, yeah, it's kind of fun to buy nice things, but the novelty wears off. And I think that's kind of where like I was thinking about this the other day, how I got my start in personal finance in the FIRE world, which was very like anti-consumerist, very reject labels, reject excess. That's freedom, right? And I really internalized that. Like, I mean, I think I really, really, that was what helped me like see the light, frankly. Like, I think it's what got me interested in, yeah, I'm going to strip my spending to the bone. Yeah, I don't need much. Oh my gosh, I can be happy with like less. And then I'm going to be free and I'll have time freedom and blah, blah, blah. But I think what happened is that as soon as I became high income enough to start affording those things for real, and affording them and still being able to save. Like, that's the thing. I think that there's this idea that like you can either have the nice stuff or you can save money. But if you have enough income that you can do both, then that was the real test. Because then it was like, oh, but what if I can just do both then? Like, let me make sure that having all the nice stuff isn't actually secretly like the path to happiness. You know, like I need to like,
they all say test that they're aligned.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure the rich people, if they're like, yeah, plebes, like, don't worry about it. It's not going to make you happy anyway. I was like, let me just pressure test this hypothesis a little bit. Let me like buy the Porsche. Let me buy the expensive shoes and do all the, and yeah, what I learned was like, yeah, okay, that was fun. Like, I enjoyed that. However,
sort of take it or leave it.
Yeah, I'm just kind of like, I don't think I'm going to buy another Porsche. You know what I mean? Like, once this car goes away, I'm like, oh, whatever. So I think once the novelty wears off, you know, I moved into a big house. I'm moving back into an apartment in a month because I'm like, I don't really want to live in a big house anymore. So I think that there's some of it that I just had to feel for myself. Like, I just had to feel it and see, does this actually permanently make me happier or not? And I think once I could feel that, like, yeah, it's nice, but it's really take it or leave it, like, that was valuable.
I find that so fascinating because it's just, you know, the more money, more problems thing is always, it's like universally a thing we all say, yeah, right, I'd like to try those problems.
Yeah.
And then almost
Yeah.
universally you get to the other side and you're like, yeah, actually it's true.
It's true and it's not true though. That's the thing. Is like I feel like I always felt kind of gaslit by that cuz it is true if you allow it to become true. You can absolutely scale your life up to the point that you're like having to I interviewed this like wealth therapist on the show once and he was like, "Well, they're having to manage the staffs on their yacht and it's a lot of work." And I was like, "Bullshit." Like, "Oh my god, give me a break." Um and but I do think that like it cannot be overstated the extent to which your life becomes easier when you can throw money at problems. And it's like so important to like not lie to people about that and to be like everyone should have that level of comfort and security where they're not worried about kind of achieving the basics. And I think that's really how my perspective has evolved is like once I felt comfort and security, I was like, oh no, this actually is really important for human flourishing. Like, it's like really messed up that more than half our country doesn't have this like basic level of like freedom.
We'll be right back with more from 50 Fires. Welcome back to 50 Fires. Let's talk a bit about scarcity and abundance. This is something I've thought about for 3 decades.
Okay.
It's really did you read The Secret?
No. No, but I do listen to the podcast If Books Could Kill, which makes fun of The Secret.
Okay,
So we
good.
might be coming at this from opposite sides of the
No,
coin,
I think we're
depending
coming.
on your
we're coming
point
at it
of
from the
view.
same. I don't think there was
Okay.
ever. I mean, I probably will get in trouble for saying this, but I don't think there's been a book that's done more damage, right? To person because it's so close to the truth. There's something really powerful about abundance, an abundance mindset, and the law of attraction. There's something true and really powerful about it. But man, you take the juvenile version, like the teenage version, like the 12-year-old version, and it causes all sorts of problems, right? Like I'm going to buy a Bentley, and I actually had a real estate agent friend of mine who came home with the Bentley one day. I'm like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Have you ever heard of The Secret?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "I bought the Bentley, and now I'm going to figure out how to pay for it. The universe will help me. Like the doors will open up." So let's talk about, with that context, let's talk about scarcity and abundance. You've talked about sort of the
I'm just imagining like going back in time and telling Karl Marx that and being like, thoughts? Like this is what they're going to be doing in the 21st century.
Yes. There's lots of people that would find that interesting. There's this specific quote. You said, if you let the energy that guides your decisions come from a place of abundance, I bet you'll identify more opportunities and choose differently.
I said this. This is a me quote.
You said this. Is
Okay.
According to my research, you said
Okay.
this.
No, that sounds like something I would say.
Yeah. If you let the energy that guides your decisions come from a place of abundance, I bet you'll identify more opportunities and choose differently. Tell me about that.
So to your point about there being a kernel of truth in The Secret mentality, I've never read The Secret, so I can't really speak. I can't like analyze
That's because
it
it's a secret,
on
Katie.
the basis of the text. Oh man, this idea that there's some like the deep state doesn't want you to know about positive thinking. It's so silly. But I do think that there is something to be said about. I almost think about it maybe abundant. It's almost like these phrases are too loaded, like scarcity and abundance. It's too much wound up in them to where they kind of like trigger a reaction for people one way or the other. But maybe what I'm trying to get at there, what I was trying to get at there was this idea of like practical delusion. Like, I think that some of the best things that have happened to me in my life have been the result of being too naive to know that I should not have been doing them. Like starting a personal finance. What business did I have? Right, I was a public relations major who worked in marketing. Like, why was I starting a blog about money? But I get that question sometimes from people who are like, "Oh, it's such a male-dominated industry. Like, how did you have the courage?" I'm like, "Courage? I didn't even think about it." Like, but that's what I mean by like naivety and delusion of just being like, well, why wouldn't I do this? But I think that's rooted, or the underlying assumption in that thought process is basically like the same thing as this law of attraction, or expectation of abundance, expectation that it's going to work out, or that uh almost not knowing any better. But I think that that creates a sort of bias toward action, which can be, it can net good results. I think that it does kind of speak to perseverance, and if you're expecting good outcomes, then like you will be more resilient, which I think is like a legitimately helpful trait. But I do think that, like, at least when I think about my own life and the moments where I made decisions now in retrospect, that I'm like, why did you have the audacity to do that? And it's like, oh, you just didn't know any better. And it worked out. So I do think that to that choosing differently element, um, I think there's something there, but I do think it's extremely important, especially in the economy that we all exist within today, the culture um that we have today, which is very like bootstrap friendly. I think I just shy away from talking like that a lot now. I prefer to focus on like systems thinking and
Mm,
systemic solutions that work for everybody.
mm, mm-hmm,
And talking about that and popularizing and normalizing those ideas,
mm,
because I just find that, like, I don't know, it's like mindset stuff's important, yeah, but I don't want people to think that it's like a substitute for
mm-hmm.
the bigger stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of what I was so curious about is like that's why I brought up The Secret, like the line between that and kind of just wishful thinking.
Mhm.
And then you
Mhm.
get in all this trouble around like if your thinking controls your outcomes, you can
It's
then say if your outcomes are not good, it must just be your thinking.
Yeah, I don't
Right. And
buy
then we get
into
into this
that
weird
at
blaming
all.
victim stuff that we see from so much of like the juvenile side of the life coaching world, right? There's like positive
Mhm.
good things that come out of life coaching, but yeah, it's so
Mhm.
interesting because some of this is just systemic.
Yeah.
Some of it is just down to luck or unluck.
Yep.
Like I cannot explain my career
Mhm.
without a massive dose of absolute luck. Yes, sure. I worked hard to increase
Right.
maybe the luck surface area, but that still doesn't account
Right.
for being a kid from Utah that got asked to do the things I got asked to do.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's really helpful. Well, what do you do personally if you find yourself sort of, and maybe we've already covered this, anything additional to talk about in terms of slipping back into scarcity? Like, is there anything
Hmm.
you do to kind of like pull yourself out of that? It's in terms of like the energy, acknowledging that the systems and the systemic problems are really important.
It's funny because I think my feelings of scarcity revolve around totally different things now. Like, I have not felt like I've slipped back into a sense of financial scarcity in a couple of years, because I got to the point in my career where that was no longer something that I was worried about on a day-to-day basis.
Can I
My
interrupt
feeling
you?
Yeah.
Because that's really important.
Mhm.
Because there are people who do. So I'm really curious if there's something you could point to. There are plenty of people who have more than they or their grandkids will ever need,
Who feel scarcity?
who still feel like tomorrow's the day.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So you're saying,
Is
like, how did I get past that?
Yeah, I'm curious if there's any because that's a really important thing because I think it's different where it's not as simple as saying there's a certain number as soon as that's in the bank, I'm no longer going to feel scarcity.
Yeah, that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, yeah, yeah. So speaking of life coaching, this is I think I've like kind of become a cynic over the last couple years, just as I've like watched a lot of the scams and grift play out, and like watched people get really rich from telling people what they wanted to hear, and like selling a like kind of like the false prophet thing. So anyway, there's a lot of that in the life coaching world. I would say that Tony Robbins model is kind of the kind of pinnacle of that side of the house. But I did hire a life coach
Mm-hmm.
slash like business coach type person at the end of 2023 because I felt very stuck in like uh things are going well. I don't feel great about them. Why don't I feel great about them? What should I do about it? And in one of our first calls, she was asking me what my goals were and like kind of trying to get to the heart of like what do you really care about in your work? Like why do you do it? What are your goals for yourself personally, whatever. And I told her, well, I really want to be a better writer. Like I think of myself as a writer. I want to be a better thinker. I want to share ideas in a way that matters and means something. And I love writing and I really want to get better at it. She's like, okay, how will you know that you're getting better at it? Like, how are we going to make sure that that's happening? And I don't remember exactly what I said, but basically I started talking about income. Like, I was like, well, last year I made this much, and if I make this much, and she was like, oh, making more money does not mean you're a better writer. And it was
Mm.
kind of this like, oh, wow moment where it felt like the spell kind of broke, where I recognized something that I had been unconsciously doing for years, which was like equating my income with how good I was at my job or like
Mm.
whether I was improving or not. And it was like, oh yeah, it doesn't mean that, does it? Like just making more money does not mean that I'm a better writer, a better thinker, my ideas are getting better. It just means that I'm making more money. Like that's all it means. And I think once I spent pretty much that entire year working on like unlearning these very capitalist ideas about value and like value creation and how you can know that you're creating value and whatever, and reorienting toward um no, the thing that actually matters to me is doing really good work, like doing work that really
Mm.
makes people think.
Mm.
And that doesn't always pay super well,
Mm.
honestly, and it costs money to develop that skill. I had to hire better editors. Um I had to start working on different projects that were more challenging. I had to get out of my comfort zone.
Mm.
Like achieving that really meant like letting go of money as the proxy for whether or not things were getting better. But I do think that that's why when you asked me the question about scarcity, I was like, now my scarcity is around like I'll
Mm.
read like an amazing essay and be like,
Mm.
"Ugh, I hate myself. Why didn't I write that?" Like I'll get
Right.
like
Right.
crazy writer envy and be like, oh my god, I'm never going to write anything good again. I'm never going to have another good idea. So now my scarcity is more so like almost intellectual scarcity. Where I'll be like, oh,
Yeah.
what if I never produce anything interesting ever again? Um but I do think that it took that kind of breaking of the spell. So I don't know. I can't speak for everybody, but I do think that money does just become a scoreboard for people. It's a scoreboard and it's a proxy by which they're judging how well they're doing. And I think unless you like consciously replace that with something else,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think in school, GPA was that thing for me. I was
Yeah.
obsessed with having the best GPA. So I think that if you're just like a striver, like money
Yeah.
can become that scoreboard. But yeah, I don't know. I think I just like replaced that and kind of swapped it in my value system for something else. And
Mm.
so
Mm.
in the
Yep.
absence of something else, it's going to be the default.
Yeah. I'll take that answer.
Okay, cool.
I'll
I'm glad
take
that
that
works for
answer.
you.
Yeah. Tell me, I'm curious what you mentioned a minute ago about you'd rather be talking instead of about mindset. You like to think more about like the systemic
Mhm.
problems. What's your favorite little soapbox? I don't mean it that way. Sorry, not little soapbox. What's your favorite thing to yell about in terms of systemic problems? I'm curious what you're thinking about.
Uh,
Let me ask a better question. Katie, what's the one systemic problem that you feel like we need to be talking more about?
Capitalism as a
Okay, let's
system.
go.
Mhm.
What tell me about
Mhm.
that?
Okay. Okay. Here's my thing. I think
Yeah.
capitalism is a system that when people talk about it, what do they say? Like what would you say the like hallmarks of capitalism are, Carl? What is it
Uh
characterized by?
hard work,
Okay.
free markets,
Yep. What else?
um uh, meritocracy,
Mhm.
entrepreneurship,
How about
building,
competition?
competition. Yep, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
competition. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. But the problem is that none of those things are the defining characteristics of capitalism. The defining characteristic of capitalism is that some people own things and some people work to make those things more valuable. Now you can there's some movement between those groups. Like I work for a wage and I use the surplus of my wages to buy index funds, which represent assets, which represent the value of other people's labor. So indirectly, I'm kind of both. I'm like an owner and a laborer, and I think everyone kind of exists somewhere on that spectrum. Somebody that's just extremely like think like a Kendall Roy. He's just pretty much an owner. He's not really doing any work. He's just benefiting from other people's. Then you have people that are working for $7 an hour that own nothing, that are spending all their wages on how they can just
Staying
get
alive.
by
Yeah.
survive, right? And that is the critical characteristic of how this system works, is that some people own things, some people work to make those things more valuable. And so I think that the biggest challenge that we face, and that which all of this other stuff is downstream from, is the fact that we don't have a democratic economy.
Mm.
And by that, I mean there's a very small number of people who get to make these types of decisions. Workplaces are like kind of authoritarian in the same sense. Like you don't get a vote the place that you work, that you get told what to do. And if you don't do it, you're in a power struggle and you're either getting fired or you're leaving or whatever. And so I think that like, I wish in this country that we hadn't been so ruined by McCarthyism and the Cold War and like the
Mm.
communism scare, to where we could actually have critical conversations about capitalism that don't just end in thought terminating cliches about how, well, it's the only system though, well, it's the best one we got, well, it's like, can we think a little bit bigger though? Can we think
Yeah.
about this in a way of like, maybe this feudalism was an improvement on slavery, capitalism was an improvement on feudalism. Why are we just stopping at capitalism and saying that's
Mm.
just the way it's got to be? And that's why this is my soapbox, is like I always hear people talk about socialist ideas and they go, well, it's nice in theory, but it would never work in practice. It's nice in theory, it doesn't work in practice. I look at capitalism, I say the same thing. Yeah, nice in theory. Look at what's happening in practice. You've got across demographic groups, the richest 10% owns everything, the bottom 50% owns basically nothing. Functionally, 1 in 4 Americans are unemployed. If you look
And
at,
even the people who won, quote unquote, seem to be relatively miserable,
yeah,
like we talked about before.
precisely.
Yeah, yeah,
They got staffs on their yacht to manage, okay? And that's really hard. So like I just think that I think that we can make it better, but I worry that like when we get stuck in these kind of like uncritical conversation, I'm like, no, here's another example of this. What do people get mad at Bernie Sanders? He's a millionaire. Okay, well, he's 80 something years old. So anyone's going to be a millionaire if you started investing when you opened a 401k 80 years ago, you're going to be a millionaire. That's just going to happen. But the idea that like believing that things should be collectively owned, or that workers should be benefiting from their labor more directly than a wage, is associated with the idea that you should be impoverished or like of austerity. It's like collective ownership
mm-hmm.
doesn't mean poverty. Collective
Mm-hmm.
owner, that in itself is capitalist propaganda. It's like, well, the only way that there can be prosperity in a system is if a small portion of people own everything and get to dole it out to everybody else.
Right.
I just don't buy that. And I think that the inequality that is inevitable in the kind of capitalism that we have in America is why I think if you could snap your fingers today and you could give people ownership in their work, like true ownership in their workplaces or of the economy, and there's a lot of interesting practical ideas for making that
Right.
happen.
Right.
I think you would see 75% of our societal challenges disappear.
Mm. It's such an interesting conversation because I struggle with the same thing. Like I've felt very uncomfortable with the system writ large for a long time, and it's hard to have good conversations about them. How do you, so on a personal level,
Mhm.
you're uh, it's almost back to the little bit of the guilt stuff. Like, how do
Mhm.
you operate, if you feel like the system is relatively broken?
Yeah.
And I don't actually know if capitalism itself fundamentally, but the version we are dealing with is broken. That's for sure, because it's more crony capitalism, right? Like the losses are the public problem. The gains are kept by the private sector.
My
Um,
profits are losses.
yeah, exactly. So, but how do you personally, because you're clearly doing just fine.
Right. Yep.
And do you just, I remember having this conversation years ago with somebody about, it was about, I think it was something about like the difference between a doctor wage and maybe a high school teacher.
Mm.
Both maybe not quite doctor, but anyway,
Yeah.
somebody who has 2 to 4 years of graduate education,
Yeah.
and one of them is making 500 and one of them is barely making 35,000.
Oh, and it's not even, you don't even have to compare doctor to teacher. Compare teacher to manager of a Chick-fil-A. Like, you know what
Perfect.
I mean? It's like
Yeah.
that's even more stark because it goes to I mean, I think that someone could sit here and make an argument to you. Well, the value that a doctor is creating in society is greater than that of a public school teacher, and here's why. And here's the it's like, oh, the value is being distributed and
What vo
allocated.
what voice is that? Is that your
What is that?
Midwest voice? Because
That's
I've
my
noticed it
no,
from the
no.
beginning of it. It's like, "Arr, arr, arr." It's like, I love it. It's
That's the
your
middle-aged men in my inbox that are like,
okay.
"You don't know anything." Milton Friedman once said. I'm like,
You've been
"Shut."
using it the whole time. I'm like, that is a great, whatever that is. I think that's like puritanical
Yeah.
Midwest voice.
Anyways, it's just the voice of like conventional wisdom that's
Love
completely
it.
incurious about
Yeah.
anything. Who's like, this is the way it is, and this is the way it's always got to be. I'm like, God, that's so boring. What a horrible way to live. But that's my point. Is like, if you were to look at, okay, a Chick-fil-A manager makes 50 to 60K. A teacher that's teaching freshman English is going to make 40. Okay, do we really as a society believe that managing a Chick-fil-A is a more valuable contribution to society than making sure people are literate? No, that's patently ridiculous. But
Mhm.
that's how capitalism works. Like the allocation of resources being quote unquote efficient, there's like this huge obsession with efficiency in the government right
Mhm.
now. It's all predicated on this underlying assumption that like the thing that you should be optimizing for is profits. And that's not compatible with like human flourishing in so many areas. So it's like
Right.
we just have to define more clearly, what do we want to optimize for? Do we want to optimize for maximum value for shareholders, or do we want to maximize for like the most people living the best quality lives that they can?
Mhm.
Because these are not the same thing. And I think that collapses under capitalism and that they get conflated with one another. Um, and
Mhm.
it's just I think like self-evidently not true. I
Yeah.
don't think you even asked me a question. I'm sorry. I just went
No, no,
off on
no. I no,
another
I think
tangent.
it's just really interesting to me because the I was talking to a friend about that. He makes a whole bunch more than a high school teacher, and he was feeling very guilty about it. And somebody else had told him, like, like it's not your job to decide how society allocates. It's not our job to worry too. Like, why do we pay somebody to bounce a basketball around? And so I don't. I it seems like a very unsatisfactory answer to me.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure there's a better one it's a little bit back to our Peter Singer conversation. Like, if I
Yeah.
get too caught up in this, how do I operate in the world?
Mhm.
Like, how do I even operate in the world, which is kind of important to be able to operate in the world.
Yeah, I definitely don't have all the answers. I think the things that I have felt the things that I feel like I've done recently, or like decisions I've made recently that I felt like they've gotten me closer to something like integrity around what I believe and acting in accordance with what I believe. I mentioned we're downsizing, like we're moving from a 4-bedroom home to a 2-bedroom apartment again, because I'm like, we just don't need all this space. So we were talking about the money that we're going to save. It's like $2,000 a month to go from a big house that you're heating and cooling and whatever, in a suburb to an apartment in a city. And so, why should we do this $2,000 a month? And it was kind of this obvious, like, oh, well, we should use this money to help someone else get housed. Like, that just seems obvious. It's money that we were spending on housing.
Right.
Why would we just continue? Why would we now say, like, why would we invest? We don't need it. We've proven we don't need it because we've been spending it. So, like, so that's a direct opportunity to be like, well, is there a shelter in the neighborhood we're moving into? Let's give it to them. And again, it's not a science. But I think that there are moments like that where now that I've been exposed to these ideas, I feel very strongly about holding myself accountable to where I am allowing a systemic critique to let me off the hook, to not have to do anything about it. So and I think that that's something with my other show, Diabolical Lies, which I co-host. We decided from the jump, like, if we're going to talk about these issues, if we are going to critique these systems on this show, we need to redistribute at least part of the subscriber revenue to causes that are going to do something about them. So there's 2 of us, so we're just splitting it 3 ways. She gets a third, I get a third goes to, a spate of causes that I've identified as, doing that work more directly. So again, it's not perfect. Someone could be like, well, you already have enough. Why wouldn't you give your entire share? Right. So I think that there's always room to do more. But I think that coming up with some sort of principled approach to, like, how do I want to exist in this world, and what level of accountability do I feel to the other human beings that I interact with, and, like, I think it comes back to this idea that the laws of capitalism say that resources go to the people who deserve them the most. That's the entire, like, premise. It's like efficiently allocating whatever. But I think that something that I've kind of gained from trying to look into this and these, like, different spiritual traditions and how do they think about this, that, like, there is a difference between something being in your possession and being rightfully yours. And I think that that can also be powerful. Like, just because I have earned this money does not mean that it rightfully belongs to me, or that, like, it should be with me. And so
what did you read or stumble upon in the traditions that was impactful in that belief? Tell me a
I
story.
started reading about Thai Buddhism, which I found interesting because they have a sufficiency principle in Thai Buddhism, which basically directly ties one person's overindulgence to the suffering of another. And I find that spiritually very powerful because I think, again, it's very convenient in capitalism. It's like, oh, the pie gets bigger. Well, my slice getting bigger, it's not a zero-sum game. Like, my slice getting bigger doesn't mean other people have less. But, like, look around, that is kind of what it means in practice. Like, that's well, kind of the source of a lot of our problems, is that, the money is not being allocated in a way that it should be. I think, like, that's just kind of obvious. So I think it's like an oversimplification to kind of point to the, like, pie getting bigger thing. But I do think that struck me as having a lot of, like, spiritual integrity of, like, and maybe that comes back to my upbringing, feeling wasteful, right? My mom being like, oh, well, waste not, want not. Like, that's, don't overindulge, because you have to find the balance for yourself. But I just find that, like, I was getting kind of tired of making those sorts of excuses for, like, why I hadn't changed my own behavior. It's like, okay, well, if you're aware of these problems and you have more than you need, then why aren't you doing anything about it? Like, what's stopping you? Adam Smith is not holding your hands behind your back, like, you could make different choices.
Yeah. One of the goals of these conversations is really just to open the aperture a bit, right? And just
Mhm.
allow us to think about things a little differently. And I love that housing example is really great. We were thinking about the same thing. We live in a resort ski town. We
Oh, wait,
had
which one?
Park City,
Oh,
Park City, Utah.
nice.
Yeah,
Oh,
and we had
wow, what a beautiful place.
yeah, our son was on the ski patrol here, and we have friends, that teach and are on the paramedics, and they, the stories, especially, a couple years ago, we had this huge snow year where it was just giant, and the ski patrol, and I mean, by the end of the season, they all looked like they had been through,
Mm,
some like just the driving from an hour away where they have to live because they can afford to live
yeah.
close,
Yep.
getting there at 3 in the morning, throwing explosives to make everything safe for people, staying till 7, then doing it again, and they all just looked like they were haggard, and I was having a lot of conversations with them about housing because it's such a problem here, and I
Mhm.
mean, any resort town.
Mhm.
And we were thinking about that. We're like, "Well, geez, we have this basement, you know, why?" And it's still a question that we haven't
Mhm.
answered quite yet.
Mhm.
Like, why? I mean, actually, what I did do was I decided, well, we can save the money from the rent at the office and let's move into the basement. But before that, we were thinking, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we let? It's got a kitchenette in it.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we let a ski patrol, especially maybe a small ski patrol family with one kid,
Mhm.
live 10 minutes from the resort instead of 90? Um, it's those kind of questions that, like, I don't. You're sort of like David White has this line. David White, the poet, has this line in one of his poems. It says, um, it's a long poem, but the thrust of it at the end is like, if you're lucky, you might come to a place that's only job is to trouble you with tiny but frightening requests. And he says, like, questions that have been patiently waiting for you. And then the last
Hmm.
line of the poem is questions that have no right to go away.
Mm.
And I think allowing ourselves to lean into the kind of money and resources questions that have no right to go away, that are like patiently waiting, troubling you.
Mhm.
And instead of running or maybe like placating that with some more spending or some entertainment, we lean into it.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, I think, and maybe this is why you guys felt challenged by that question, like, well, wait, why wouldn't we do? It kind of feels like a moment of like the room kind of like tilting on an axis where you're like,
Mm,
yeah, why wouldn't we? And yeah, well, I guess there really isn't a good reason, is there? And I think part of what I started to struggle with, and maybe you relate to this, is like the scalability of that type of behavior. Like, I'm like, well, if I'm going to give 2,000, well, then why wouldn't I give five? Or why wouldn't we?
mhm.
You're like, well, that's just going to help it for one person. That's not going to fix the housing crisis in resort ski towns. Like, you kind of start to worry about, at least I did, like the where does it stop, or the does this really do anything, or does it really help, like that sort of mentality. And I I think thinking about scale is how I got into like systems thinking to begin with, but I do think that on a solutions front, in the interim, before we seize the means of production, is I kind of feel like there is an element of this that can only ever be handled at the local
Yeah.
level, and like thinking locally again of like, yeah, I'm not going to solve the housing crisis, but like there's like one additional person that might have a better situation, or two additional people, um because of something that I am able to do, something that I am able to
Yeah.
give, or offer up. And I don't know, I don't think philanthropy is the answer. Like, I want to make that very clear, because I think that philanthropy is also kind of a way of, like, I think there are very real critiques of philanthropy as it's a way of kind of um altruizing the ultra rich and like giving them even more power. But
Mhm.
I do, I don't know, it just no longer felt like it was sitting right with me to be like, yeah, but that's not my problem, or like, yeah, but I can't fix that. So I don't know. I think that sense of like embedded powerlessness, or like civic helplessness, these are all phrases that have felt very resonant to
Mhm.
me, of just kind of like how we kind of get trained to see these things as not our problem, and therefore something that we have no power over. Um
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think they're worth thinking about, and I think they're worth talking about, and I think that more people feel that way or are grappling with that, or once introduced to those types of questions would start thinking that way if we kind
Yeah.
of normalize them as being worth asking.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think we had Krista Tippett on, and when I
Mm.
asked her about a question about enough, she said, "You know what? That's a question I'm just going to live with this year."
Hmm.
And I love that idea of shifting the calculus from solution, like I'm going to solve this question, I'm going to answer this question, like grit my teeth to,
Mhm.
I'm just going to let this question work on me a bit. Like
Mhm.
yes, it doesn't hide. I don't need that. Doesn't give me an excuse to hide from action, but just because I don't know the ultimate answer doesn't mean I can't help now. And I think scale is like a trick of the like worrying about scale is a trick of the devil, right? Like metaphorical devil. It's a trick that tricks us into never doing anything about it.
Yeah.
And so like
Yeah.
just getting to the point where like, look, I don't know the answer, but I'm not going to run away from the question. And I'm going to see what I can do here. That's what Peter Singer said too. He's like, look, it's just, you just do what you can and you start now. So Katie, that's super helpful. Can I ask you just a couple like rapid fire questions as
Sure.
we
I'm
wrap
not
up?
very concise, so I'll try.
Me neither. So it's fine. Let's just wrap up with a couple.
Okay.
I'm curious what sufficient would mean to you. Like, what does having sufficient for your needs mean to you?
To me, I think sufficient for my needs is I'm like, can I borrow Krista Tippett's answer? Um
We all do.
ah, I'm struggling because as I'm thinking about what matters most to me now as like what is most important for my well-being, I'm thinking about like in like almost like engagement, like engagement with my life, like feeling fulfilled by the things that I'm spending my time doing.
Mhm,
But then I'm
mhm.
recognizing that like that is predicated on like the lower levels of the
Right,
hierarchy of needs being met. So it's like
right.
I don't want to sit here and tell you that like, well, food, shelter, warmth, like the obvious things, but I don't know. I'm kind of now I'm like, wow, the fact though that I'm thinking about like oh, being like engaged with my work, feeling interested and like engaged
Mm,
with the world around me. Like that's really what is makes me feel good at the end of the day that
mm,
relies on a lot of those other needs being
mm.
met. So I don't know. I
I love that. I love that. Let's pretend like I'm still doing this show 20 years from now. And I have a guest on named Anne. Anne's 38.
Okay.
And she read Rich Girl Nation when she was 18, when she was 18, right? So 20 years later, and I ask her what money means to her. What do you hope she would have learned from you about that? 18-year-old Anne.
I hope that she read my book and felt like becoming financially autonomous was something that was within her reach. I think that that's the simplest answer that I can give is just
Mm, mm,
recognizing it as an outcome that is possible for you.
mm,
Um, yeah, and feeling like she knew what she needed to do to get there. I think that that's one of the most important, like a lot of the one of the most important outcomes or consequences of the last couple years is like anytime I get an email from someone being like, I didn't realize that I could afford
mm,
to, I didn't know how to do it. And like once I saw it was possible, it like kind of then it impacted my behavior. Then it changed my actions. Now I'm, this far along. Now I have a house. Now I'm debt free. Now I have. And so I think that those types of stories, though, always have to begin with like the recognition of like, oh, this is possible for me. Like I am capable of doing this. And so I think that that's what I hope Anne takes away.
That's perfect. Katie, thanks so much for the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. That was one of like the most fun interviews I think I've ever done.
That's my goal. To have somebody say that. No, thank you. That was really fun. "50 Fires" is a production of Blind Nil Audio in association with The Roost. I'm looking forward to our next conversation around the fire. Cheers, my friends.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in the series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Chip and Joanna Gaines, Blind Nil Audio, nor Magnolia.